Hey there, my Attachment Theory in Action podcast listeners and viewers. I'm your host, Jenna Kelly, and I'm really excited to share this next interview with you where I sit down with Karen Andor. She's an educational psychologist and psychotherapist who has a private practice in the UK. She's also worked as a specialist support teacher in South Africa, and in her time as a teacher, she was working with a population that was very under-resourced. And she had to learn how to develop tools, practical tools to help children that had special needs. And so she's continued to take that philosophy into her work, where she's now developed these other tools to help fill another gap, which is around understanding childhood dissociation. So she's going to break this down for you all in a way that is very nuanced, but also easy to digest. I know she really opened up my eyes on this topic, and then she's going to share a case and some tools and things that she's used. So if you're listening to this, I highly encourage you to also check this out on our YouTube channel, because she's going to show us the therapy dolls that she's created that help give language and understanding to the different parts that are sometimes associated with childhood dissociation. These therapy dolls are not yet available on her website, but she is expecting them to be available in the coming months. So stay tuned and watch out for those. She also has a workbook available on her website to be used with therapists who have also gone through her training. So she's got a training that's going to go into more depth on childhood dissociation that should soon be available on demand. So we'll also link that website, and that training will be available in October. So again, stay tuned depending on when you're listening to this, so that you can check out her training. I know I want to as well. And you'll see that Karen has just a wealth of knowledge and training, and she's trained in psychodynamic play therapy, TheraPlay training, dyadic developmental psychotherapy, and her knowledge around this topic is going to just help expand your ways of thinking around it. And I can't wait for you to have access to these tools too as they become available. So without further ado, enjoy my interview with Karen. Hello, Karen. Welcome. I am so delighted to be joining you in conversation today so we can talk more about childhood dissociation, which is something I know you've come to focus on in your work. And I'm really interested in this topic, and I'm sure our listeners and viewers are going to be as well. In fact, I posted in our Facebook group that I was interviewing you, and they already had some really thoughtful questions that I know we'll get into today. But first, we're also interested in who you are, and I would love for you to share an attachment memory that just feels really important to who you are and your work. So could you start us off with that, please?
All right. Well, nice to see you again, Jenna. And yeah, the memory I have that's important to me is just like, cuddles with my grandmother. She was just one of the most cuddly people. And I just think, cuddles are so regulating, and they're so holding, and they're so affirming. So that's one of my favorite attachment memories.
That just helped settle my nervous system a little bit, because I was feeling, the interview jitters, and also made me think, bringing your grandma into this space, but it also made me bring my grandma in and think of my attachment memories. So thank you for making me feel all warm and tingly. But let's continue with your journey. Tell us more about who you are, and how is it that you came to focus more on childhood dissociation?
Okay, so it's a bit of a long story, but I'll try and make it as short as possible. So I'm trained as an educational psychologist, and I trained in South Africa. So the way the training works there, it's sort of like a bit of a mixture of educational psychology, or I think in America it's called school psychology, and then a bit of clinical psychology as well. So I learned how to assess children, how to support them in school, how to support teachers, but also how to do therapy with children. And my original training was in family therapy, play therapy, so psychodynamic play therapy, and a little bit of CBT that was thrown in as well. So that was my original training. And then as I worked with children and also worked with adults as well, because that was part of my training, what became very clear for me was that attachment is often at the heart of things. And so that led me into looking at attachment-based therapies. So I became a certified Theraplay therapist. And to support my adult clients, I went into sensory motor psychotherapy as well. And I've done other trainings around all of this. So just really to kind of see where I was not meeting clients' needs and where I could support them better. And then I thought, okay, I'm kind of there. I've got all, filled all the holes, and I can really support clients. And so I had this little girl that I had for Theraplay, and she'd been adopted, and she had lovely adoptive parents. They were just lovely people. And in the beginning, the Theraplay sessions were just going brilliantly. And then as time went by, and I'll explain what was happening, but I didn't know what was happening at the time, she would come into the therapy room, she would engage in some of the Theraplay activities, and then we'd get to a point where she'd just start screaming. And one of the worst things that would happen is she'd lie on the floor on her back with her arms outstretched, and she'd just shout, "Mummy, mummy, 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 mummy." And her adoptive mum would then come to approach her to pick her up and cuddle her, because her daughter was calling for her. And as soon as she came near her, she'd kick her away. But at the same time, she still had her arms outstretched and was just calling for her. And she would just spend most of the session like that, just screaming. So it was horrible for this little girl. She was clearly very distressed. It was incredibly distressing for this adoptive mum who wasn't sure how to support this little girl. And it was very distressing for me, because it didn't matter what I did, how much supervision I had, session after session, at some point this would happen in various forms, but that's just one example of it. And I had done Janina Fisher's training. She has a model called trauma-informed stabilization treatment, and that's for adults. So I've been using it with my adult clients. It's brilliant therapy, but it hadn't occurred to me that I could, apply that to a child. And I suddenly realized this little girl was dissociating. And dissociation is a complicated thing. Different people have different ideas about what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But the way I understand it is that it's we dissociate into our survival defenses. So this little girl was dissociating into her attachment cry, which was her arms outstretched and calling for her mum because she wanted to be comforted. But at the same time, her fight defense was kicking her mum away, because she needed, that part didn't trust this new mum, because she'd been taken away from her biological mum, had a foster placement, had another foster placement, and then was placed with her adoptive parents.
Yes.
She had a number of ruptures in her attachment, so that fight response was protecting her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lots of adaptive strategies that this little girl was using, and it also sounds like you kind of identified this gap in your knowledge and skills and what was working well for adults. It was like, how do I then apply this to this little girl, that you were also feeling very distressed and like, what is this working? Which I think we've all felt when we can't make sense of behaviors, and we can feel like that as parents, caregivers, therapists, teachers, all of that in our work. And you also talked about the definition of dissociation. So let's break this down a little bit more. You mentioned the attachment cry and the fight. Can you share more about the different parts of dissociation, how you understand it in your work?
Sure. So for me, it's very much based on Janina Fisher's work, because she was my trainer, and it just works so well with adults. And she's based it on a number of different models, but one of the primary models is the structural dissociation model. So the structural dissociation model says that basically when we're traumatized, we will then have a part of us that can get on with normal life. Yeah, so it can kind of manage going, if we're a child, going to school, playing, kind of getting on with our chores. If we're an adult, it's the part of us that can kind of look after our kids, go to work, do the shopping, all of those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
So that part still functions and kind of gets on with normal life. And then we have these survival defenses that kick in. And the survival defenses are fight, flight, freeze, submit, and attachment cry. And they start to kind of manifest in their own ways. So they kind of operate independently of each other, and they will do what they can to protect us. And this often happens in children, because if they've had some kind of rupture in their attachment, what will happen is that the attachment system will trigger the defensive system. And this is really the work of Giovanni Liotti. He was saying that kind of disorganized attachment will always lead to some form of dissociation, where you have this part that kind of gets on with normal life, and then these parts that operate independently. So the fight response in children, so obviously in adults it works a bit differently, but in children, it's often when kids will scream, they'll hit, they'll kick, they'll bite, they'll spit, they'll want to destroy things, they'll rip things up. Those are kind of the sort of behaviors of the fight response. And it's just that defense mechanism trying to protect the child from being hurt. If they're going to the flight response, then they tend to kind of run away, or they'll retreat and hide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the more you try and get them out from wherever they're hiding, the further back they will retreat. And it can, as they sort of grow and develop, it can become a form of anxiety. So they'll become quite OCD about things, and they'll want to make sure that things are kind of like perfect and lined up and whatnot. Freeze response is fear. So that's just fear. And it's basically that sort of deer in the headlights response. So if some kind of something happens, like, a car headlights come towards it and it's not sure what this is, it goes into this freeze response. And that response is, I would argue, not a shutdown response, which is often what people think it is. It's not a dorsal vagal collapse. It's quite an active response, because although the body is frozen into space, or whatever, it's frozen rigid, it's still a lot of tension in the body to keep it in that frozen space. That requires energy to freeze the body. If it was a dorsal vagal collapse, that person would just kind of collapse to the floor. And also the eyes are very aware, they're taking in information, and so are the ears, because that freeze response is almost like, well, what is this? And what am I going to do next? Am I going to go into fight, or am I going to go into flight? And then the submit response is also an animal defense. So animals will often go into a submit response, and that's like just to show that they're not a threat. So in children, what happens is they tend to be incredibly helpful. And that's how they protect themselves. So that's not how they protect themselves. That's how the defense protects them.
Right.
Yeah. And it's also like the defense that tries to make that child a really good girl or a good boy. So really helpful, not a threat, very valuable. And then attachment cry is that cry, babies, it's attachment cry most of the time. Yeah. And that attachment cry is to get the parents or the caregivers' attention, to support that baby. So to meet their needs. Are they cold? Are they hungry? Are they lonely? So what happens if, for whatever reason, those needs aren't met? That attachment cry persists. And it ends up manifesting in a child that's really needy, that struggles with separation anxiety. They become like these little shadows, and they follow the parents around all the time, or they follow their teachers around all the time. So those are the 5 basic survival defenses. And then, just because I found it really helpful, I have added in 2 additional ones. So this is based on the work of Dan Hughes, and he's a very well-known attachment therapist. And he says that when children's attachment needs aren't met appropriately for whatever reason, the way they cope is by becoming quite controlling.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, I'm in control. I'll meet my needs. I don't trust adults to do this for me. And if we also look at the work of Lyons Ruth and her colleagues, they found that children with disorganized attachment become quite controlling in middle childhood. So this is before they hit adolescence. So it's also just that way of managing that horrible feeling inside of that disorganized attachment. So it's a little bit different to Janina Fisher's model, because Janina would say that control is an aspect of the fight response, and I don't disagree with her. But for children, that's quite difficult for them to understand, because when they're in a fight response, they're usually quite angry, because that's the emotion that the fight response has. But the control response isn't often angry. It's often just really quite stubborn. And it doesn't feel the same to children because they're quite concrete. They're not as abstract as we are. So I've made it a separate part to help them understand that. And then I've also added in shame, which is part of Dan Hughes's work as well. And he said that, when children's basic needs aren't met appropriately, because they're so egocentric, they feel that there is something wrong with them, and that's why their needs aren't being met or haven't been met. And also just their life experiences. So when they are dissociating into these different defenses, they end up being punished for them often, because, if they're hitting like a sibling, or they're hitting a teacher, they'll often get disciplined for that, even though they're not really in control of this. So that then, when they go back into their sort of selves and the defense isn't being activated, then they feel shamed or ashamed because they weren't able to control that behavior. So I've often heard comments from children, I just wish there was something, better with my brain. There's something wrong with my brain. I wish it could be fixed. I'm not a good girl. I'm not a good boy. So there's that shame. And again, Janina would say shame is part of the submit defense, but submit in children is very helpful. It's trying to be a good girl or boy. And shame is a horrible, overwhelming feeling of there's something really wrong with me. So again, I've separated them because they don't feel the same for children. So it becomes quite confusing if I have them as part of those, if I have shame as part of submit and control as part of fight.
Okay, that is really helpful. And I appreciate how you normalize these defensive states, and not only normalize, but they all have these very important duties to protect this child and to keep this child safe. And sounds like it's our work then of the adults to help them then understand, give language and understanding to these different parts, so that hopefully we can, bypass that shame, that this isn't something you have to feel ashamed about, that your brain is actually, there's nothing wrong with it. Your brain is actually doing what it's supposed to do to try to keep you safe. So that's really helpful. And that was one of the questions that somebody asked in the Facebook group is, how does dissociation look different in children than it does in adults? And I think you really illustrated that. Is there anything else you would say to that question, Karen?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think mostly what people think when they think about dissociation is they think that it's somebody kind of spacing out or zoning out, or like they're just collapsing. And that can certainly be an aspect of dissociation. So sometimes that zoning out might be the freeze response. Sometimes the zoning out might be the flight response. It's kind of like that internal flight away into fantasy or into another world. And then there is, for some children and adults who are completely overwhelmed, and this does happen, unfortunately, in cases of severe abuse, they will then go into this dorsal vagal collapse, where it looks like they're sleeping, but they're not sleeping. It's that kind of shutdown, sort of feigned death response. So that can happen, but generally it's these very primitive defenses that happen in children. And because children aren't as sophisticated as we are, they come out in their very raw form in these behaviors. So that's much more common.
Okay.
And I think we don't understand it as dissociation. We understand it as the child being really naughty.
Yes.
And yeah.
Yes,
And so,
I think we can assign a lot of intentionality to these behaviors. Yeah, this child's acting out, being bad, pushing my buttons, all of those things, and they're really just biologically trying to survive.
absolutely. And sometimes, obviously, children are naughty. They'll kind of look at you and then they'll like punch their brother, and that's quite intentional. The difference, and I think this is important to kind of look at it for me, when I look at what's intentional kind of pushing boundaries kind of behavior and what is dissociative behavior, is that the intentional behavior, it's kind of, you can see sort of the thought process in it. Whereas this dissociative behavior kind of comes out of the blue. It's out of proportion. It doesn't make sense. So it might be like the parent asks the child to put their shoes on. And suddenly this child is just screaming and lying on the floor. And, it's just out of control. It's out of proportion to what was asked. And it goes on and on and on. And for me, those are sort of clues that that's more dissociative than that child being naughty.
Okay.
If you can say there's such a thing as being naughty. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So it really sounds like it's this continuum of different strategies. And for our listeners and viewers who are interested more in hearing about the dorsal vagal piece, because I think I did think of it in more simplistic terms. And so we have an episode with Deb Dana that you can learn more about the polyvagal theory. But the way you're explaining it is much more rich and nuanced too, in these different defensive states. And, that they can kind of become their own parts and their own, separate part of functioning from this kind of normal everyday, like you said, the child that goes to school and can keep it together until they start to feel threatened, whether that's a real threat or something more likely, something from the past in their attachment story, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's generally an implicit memory. So an implicit memory is something that's it's stored in the right brain. It's very unconscious, and it'll just be something that triggers that memory that will then trigger a survival part to take over.
Okay. So if we bring a little more of the neuroscience into it, speaking of right brain and left brain, young children are very right brain dominated. And so when there's been attachment trauma and other forms of trauma, that they then become even more kind of compartmentalized from left, as the left brain's continuing to develop, and kind of that bottom top development, and then can become, stuck or overactivated in these defensive states. Is that, am I understanding that correctly, Karen?
Yeah, pretty much, Jenna. So basically the way our brains develop is that we're not left brain dominant when we're small children or infants. So we're right brain dominant, and we're right brain dominant for quite a long period of time. So there's sort of spurts of development in the left hemisphere. So when we develop language, there's like a little bit of left hemisphere dominance. And then as we enter adolescence, we become more left hemisphere dominant. But it takes a really long time for that left hemisphere to develop. So the parts are contained, or they exist within the right hemisphere. And I think this is the difficulty, because that's more unconscious, it's more implicit memory, whereas our rational thinking side of ourselves is in the left hemisphere. And I think the mistake we make as adults when we're dealing with children is that we kind of think they're little mini us's, and they think like we do. And that if we rationalize with them, they'll be rational. So children will struggle with that in general, just because of the way our brains develop. But when a child's been traumatized, they're going to struggle with it even more. And so if a child's dissociating, and we try and kind of we reason with them, and we're like, come on, we didn't ask you to do anything horrible. We just asked you to put your shoes on. You're not going to be able to rationalize with these parts because they're housed within the right hemisphere. So what they really need is particular methods of working with them, and a lot of co-regulation, down-regulation, and we do that through specific ways of talking and through specific somatic strategies.
And I'd love to get into those a little bit more too. Before we do, on the extreme end of dissociation, and what some people may think of when they hear dissociation, is dissociative identity disorder, which is actually very rare. And so I think it might be helpful for you to touch on this a little bit more too, to help our listeners kind of distinguish with what we're meaning with dissociation versus kind of the extreme end of the continuum with dissociative identity disorder.
Okay, so again, I can only go from what I've seen with clients and my experience. And I go into schools a lot and observe children with various difficulties. And the model that makes the most sense to me is the structural dissociation model. And it's got 3 levels to it. So the first level is primary structural dissociation, which is when a child or an adult has experienced one traumatic event. And so they still have that part of them that continues with normal life. And then they have another part that will house whatever the trauma is, and all the emotions and the sensations and the fragments of memory around that trauma. So that would be primary structural dissociation. What I've been talking about is secondary structural dissociation. So that's, in my opinion, very common for traumatized children. So children who've not always had their attachment needs met, or children who have had experiences of abuse or neglect. And that's where you've got the going on with normal life part, and then you've got the fight, flight, freeze, submit, and attachment cry parts. Then the next level is tertiary structural dissociation. And this is where the part that gets on with normal life starts to split into different parts. So there'll be parts that kind of get on with work or school. There'll be parts that are very social, and that's their job. There'll be parts that kind of get on with chores, and they all have different kind of roles. So that part starts to split into different parts. And then the survival parts start to split as well. And they start to get, have like personalities, not really, but they'll have names, ages, and preferences. But they will still be along the lines of the fight response. You'll get parts that are very keen on protecting, and you'll get the flight response, which are very anxious parts, and so on. So, and that usually happens when there's been extreme abuse. So that person in their childhood hasn't been able to escape or have any support around them. That's usually what causes it.
Okay. And the way it gets portrayed in our media is usually these awful examples, and the way you just described it is much more normalizing, and makes sense. it makes good sense that people have had to develop these different parts to, try to find some sort of way to resolve this internal conflict of, I need to feel safe, but especially from a young child's perspective, the person that's supposed to protect me and help me feel safe is also a source of fear.
Absolutely.
I think another example that gets a bad rap are people with borderline personality disorder. And I know there's some research that suggests that young children with disorganized attachment can often go on to develop borderline personality disorder. But so can you say more about that, Karen?
Yeah, so again, this is very much informed by Janina Fisher, and I agree with her. Borderline personality disorder it shouldn't be called a disorder, nor should dissociative identity disorder.
Right.
They're not disorders, really. They are coping mechanisms. And so with borderline personality, it's really a structure that child develops in order to cope with not having their attachment needs met appropriately. And then that becomes through their implicit memory, so it's unconscious, how they cope with life, how they approach relationships, how they manage their internal world. So yeah, it's not a disorder, in my opinion. It's a way of coping.
I agree. Yes. And when we look at it like that, again, we bring more understanding and compassion to these very adaptive ways of being, even if it presents as challenging in our relationships and when we're interacting with children and adults. It's what they've needed to do to cope, to survive. So thank you for those explanations. So let's go back to this little girl that you started with. And can you elaborate more on, once you were able to give more name and understanding to what she was exhibiting, how did that then change your therapeutic approach? And what are some strategies that the adults can use with children who are dissociating?
Okay, so when I identified it, I was like, how on earth am I going to approach this with a little girl? Because when she started working with me, she was 4. So at this stage, she's about just, on the cusp of 4 or 5 years old. So she's very young and very concrete in her thinking. And I've got this model that I've been talking to adults about that is quite complicated to understand. So I was like, how on earth am I going to help her understand what's going on inside her? So the first thing I did before I did anything was talk to her parents. And I explained what I thought was happening. And I explained the whole structural dissociation and the different parts and how they were manifesting in the therapy sessions. And they were like, yes, this makes sense. We can see that. And we can also see how it's manifesting at home as well.
Mm-hmm.
So they were really on board for going for this and giving it a go. So then I was like, well, how am I going to introduce it to her? So what I did is I created a doll. And the doll I called Diddy, which is in sort of homage to people who struggle with this. So I called it DID, Dolly. So it's Diddy.
Yes, got to have fun with it.
Yeah, I got to have fun with it. And it's just, a homage to the people who struggle with this. So I created this doll. And what I did is I took it in to explain to her what was happening, so I could show it to her in a very concrete visual form. And I said to her, I think I have a good idea what's going on. I know you've been really struggling. We've had these sessions where you've just been screaming and you've not felt good. I didn't tell her that I wasn't feeling good or that Mum wasn't feeling good either, because I didn't want to lay that on her. But, it's obviously made me feel like a complete failure as a therapist. And I was definitely failing her up to that point. so I showed her this doll, and I showed her specifically that example that I told you about, where she had her arms out, calling for her mum, and she was kicking her away at the same time. And I said that there's this attach part. I don't call it attachment cry for children because it's just too long a phrase. So it's just better to keep it simple. And I said, this is what the attach part does. The attach part wants to keep adults close. It wants to make sure that adults are looking after us. It wants adults to give us a cuddle. That's its job. And then we've got the fight part. And the fight part's job is to push people away and keep you and the attach part safe. So I showed her using this doll how that was playing out. And then I explained all the different parts and different scenarios that had happened in the therapy sessions with each of these parts, specifically how it related to her. And the relief on this little girl's face is something that I will remember forever, because I think she just felt, oh, this makes sense. Somebody gets what's going on inside of me, and I understand what's going on inside of me too now. And what that did is it just pushed our therapy forward. So from being stuck in this horrible space, where I felt like a failure, this child was in distress, her parents were in distress, to being able to move forward with the therapy and have something that we could work with so that she could get her attachment needs met, because she so desperately needed that. And therapy is a fantastic way of doing that. But we had a way of working with these defense mechanisms. And the way I worked with the defense mechanisms is a combination of my sensory motor training, my therapy training, and my dyadic developmental psychotherapy training. So I would talk about all of the parts. I would sometimes talk to the parts. Sometimes I'd talk about the parts with her mum if it was too difficult for her in that moment to kind of come back. So she'd be blended with a part. So blending is a term that Janina Fisher uses, which is where the going on with normal life self is then kind of becoming the part, and it's not like separate from the part.
Okay, so it's a way to kind of integrate.
Yeah, it's not integrating it. You actually want them to be separate from each other. That's what causes the sort of integration in a way. So Dan Siegel talks about that things need to be different. We need to understand that we have different aspects to ourselves, and we need to understand those different aspects. And then the sort of integration is through understanding and linking, rather than that we become this one whole thing. So when somebody's blended with a part, they can't manage that part. That part is taking over, and that part is kind of running the show. So when they unblend from that part, then you've got that prefrontal cortex, you've got the left brain online, and then it can help to manage what's going on in the survival defense, if that makes more sense.
Got it. Yes, that does make sense. And I would think the dolls are a way to help do that too, to kind of externalize it more. Yes. So that you can understand it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the dolls I can use to regulate the child. I can visually do little stories. I can talk to the dolls. These are different things I can do with them to help with that process and to down-regulate that part.
Wonderful. You also talked about how you felt like a failure in working with this little girl. Again, a feeling that I know most of us can relate to in our work and caregiving. And so I appreciate that vulnerability, but that also makes me wonder, how do we as adults, because our nervous systems talk to each other. And so if her nervous system is in these defensive states, it's more likely to elicit that in us. And so what did you learn to do, Karen, to regulate your own system and stay grounded when you're working with clients who are in these defensive states?
Good question. So again, my therapy training has helped me to be very regulated. So I can, down regulate my own system through that. So I can notice when I'm starting to kind of get activated and then go, okay, I need to kind of down-regulate. But also just understanding that it's parts, I think helps a huge amount, that this is a part and we need to help this part. So I think, initially it was just me using my own somatic strategies to regulate myself. Even though I was feeling like a failure, I was doing, my best to stay regulated within the session. But once I knew it was parts, that helped me to manage it better for the client and for myself, because then I had strategies I could use to manage each part, as opposed to feeling, I don't quite know what to do here.
It sounds like that's really been a theme so far of what we've been talking about, is when we bring understanding into these parts, these defensive states, that again, it kind of helps you then externalize from that. Rather than getting sucked in, you're able to take a step back and remain in your prefrontal cortex and remain more regulated and curious about what are these parts trying to communicate right now.
Absolutely. And curiosity is, you kind of hit the nail on the head. Curiosity is such a powerful thing for us as therapists to have. It's just being curious, because if we're curious, that's not scary. Curiosity is not scary. Yes. Curiosity is like, I'm interested, I'm intrigued, I want to know more, I want to learn more. So that's really helpful. The other thing that's really helpful is that children will often trigger into a number of these parts at the same time. So being able to learn how to identify all the parts that have been triggered, and then how you're going to manage each one of those parts, that's something I found incredibly helpful, because otherwise it is very overwhelming. So for example, with that little girl, she had just triggered into 2 parts. So at the time I was feeling that was overwhelming, but I've had children who can trigger into 4 parts at the same time, and that's even more overwhelming. So understanding what's happening, which parts have been triggered, and knowing, okay, I've got strategies to regulate each of these parts, makes it much more manageable. So it kind of is like, I suppose, having a roadmap or a structure in which to work. And that becomes less overwhelming, I find, for myself as a therapist.
Can you elaborate on the child that where 4 parts are present at once? Because that does feel overwhelming. What do you do to work with that child in that situation?
Okay. So if there's a child where there's a number of different parts triggering at the same time, if they're all triggering right then and there, exactly at the same time, what I have to do is then I'll try and figure out, and again, being a therapist and having done sensory motor training, I've also done something called SPIM 30, which is Ralph Vocht's therapy for dissociation. So I've got a number of tools in my toolbox. What I'll tend to do is I will figure out some kind of activity that we can do that's going to meet a number of these different parts' needs. So for example, if a child is going into a fight response, so they're kind of pushing a parent away, and they're going into a attach response, so they want the parent close to them, and then they're going into shame at the same time, what I'll do is I'll think of a fun activity. So it might be an example is a Theraplay activity, which is push me over, pull me up. So I'll start structuring it, and I'll say, right. And another part, that might be part of all of this is control. So I wouldn't take the control away from the child. I'm not going to change all that behavior, but I'm just going to structure it. So I go, right. Mum's going to sit here, you're going to sit there, and you're going to push mum over, and I'll put structure in, and I'll count, 1, 2, 3, push. And now you're going to pull mum up. So I'm still using that attach parts need to pull, and the fight parts need to push away. And the way I'm mediating the shame is I'm making this into a fun activity. It's not something that's horrible and bad, and you need to stop it right now. No, we're not going to stop it. We're going to do something fun around it that's going to meet those parts' needs. and that the child still has some element of control, because I'm not going, okay, we're going to do something completely different. Yes, we're going to meet the attached parts needs, but we're going to do it in a different way. So we're going to have a cuddle, because right then that's not what's happening. And we're going to start like punching a punch bag, but because that's not what the fight part wants to do then. The fight part wants to push away, not punch. So that's how I'd use a whole load of one activity to manage a whole load of parts that are triggering at exactly the same time. But there's also something that I find, which I call trigger chains, which is one part will trigger another part, which will trigger another part, which will trigger another part. And in that instance, so let's say the attach part has then triggered the fight part. So let's say the child wants the parent's attention. And the parent's not giving them their attention. So then the fight part will come in and it might punch the parent. And then the parent will tell the child off and say, stop it. That's not okay. And then the control part will come in and it's now like kind of colluding with the fight part and is punching more. And then the child gets told off even more. So then you've got the shame part. And then that child will kind of curl into a ball and hide their face in shame.
I
There's
like
no that.
I like that term, trigger chains. It makes me think kind of like a domino effect.
Yes. Yeah. So there's no point in dealing with the attachment part that started it all. We've got to deal with what's happening in the moment. And in the moment, we've got the shame response. So then the way I work with shame is I tend to normalize things, and I'll just talk about how we all have shame and how, of course, if this has happened, that might make you feel that way. And then I'll say, but that's not really what's going on. You haven't been naughty. It's basically that these parts are trying to get mummy or daddy's attention. So I'll deal with that. Then I might need to kind of talk about the control. And this is what control was doing. And control was doing it because this is what fight wanted. So I normally don't necessarily have to meet each one of those parts' needs specifically. It's usually meet the part that's triggered last, talk to the parts in between, and explain what's happened, and then meet the initial one, which is the attached part, which really wanted some closeness or some attention.
I like that formula. Okay. So let's talk more about the tools and resources, because that example just was so rich of the beautiful work that you're doing and the way you've come to understand these parts. And even though you've had a lot of training in these different therapy modalities, even if you haven't had all this training, we can learn to better speak the language of the nervous system and these defenses. Yeah. So can you tell us more about the tools or resources? You mentioned the dolls. I know you have a workbook. Where can we learn more? What have you developed, Karen?
So I've recently recorded a training with the Academy of Therapy Wisdom, where I've kind of tried to distill it so that any therapist who's had any kind of training will be able to learn about the parts, learn about dissociation, and then learn specific techniques for each of the parts. So, and there's quite a lot of different techniques because each part will manifest in different ways. So I've created that training, which will be available hopefully from mid-October this year onwards. Oh. It'll be on demand.
Wonderful.
In terms of,
I want to go, or I want to take it.
In terms of the workbook that's available, so the workbook is just to give structure. The reason why I developed the workbook was I had an adult client that it was really helpful for them to see this in a very concrete way. So I used it with them during COVID because I was working online. And also I was working with a little boy online. So I used it with him as well because I wasn't in the room with him. So I needed something to have a structure that we could work with that was concrete, that they could look at and that they could interact with. But the workbook is to be used with a therapist who's done the training. It's not like a self-help type workbook. It's an aid to therapy. So it's just a way to structure that. And it certainly can go with the dolls as well. So it can be used standalone, or it can be used with the dolls. The dolls, which I've created, and I can show you them. So
yes, please.
So there's
would that be the fight part doll?
That's the fight doll.
Okay.
And then this is flight. So flight's running.
Ah.
And then I've got freeze.
Okay, kind of this like gray.
Yeah, just that frozen.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've got submit. He's kind of a bit floppy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I've got the little attach part.
Mm.
And each of these parts will, they've got like a little pouch at the back to show when they're not activated. So you can just fold them into their little pouch. So it's a concrete way of showing the child or adult, because some people will be using these with adult clients, that part is not activated, it's not triggered in that particular situation. So it just folds up into a little ball. And they all fit into Diddy. So
Diddy.
This is
Who holds all the parts.
Who holds all the parts. And if Diddy doesn't have the parts, Diddy's very flat and two-dimensional. But when all the parts are inside of Diddy, then Diddy has a lot more substance to him or her.
So for all of our listeners, you'll have to go to our YouTube channel too to see this, because these dolls are really cool.
So then, whoops, Diddy's got a lot more substance.
Wow.
So I don't have shame and control just yet, because it has cost a lot to make these dolls. So it's just for financial reasons. I'll just have little cardboard cutouts for now. But if people are interested, I will be making shame and control to go in as well. And there'll be space within Diddy for that. So yeah, the dolls I'm hoping will be available from the end of this year, from the end of 2023 onwards.
Okay.
But certainly people don't need to have the dolls to do the therapy. It's just a resource I made for myself. I've put a lot of thought into them. Everything I've done with them has a purpose. But there's certainly ways that people can get figures, so they can use specific toys. They could use sand tray if they do sand tray therapy. If they do art therapy, they could get the child to draw the different parts and then use those in their session. So it's just a resource I've made. It's not essential by any means, but it just made my therapy a lot easier.
It's really neat. I can't wait till they're available. Just looking at them, and I like the reminder that we can use having these concrete representations. So if you don't have the dolls, thinking about what else you can use, I think is really important. But when just looking as you showed them, I again could feel my own response of just, like I said, the theme of our talk today, Karen, is like, oh, this makes sense. And now not only do I have language for it, but I have something that I can see that represents the way that my body, my nervous system, and physiology is trying to help me adapt and cope. So such a gift that will be available soon. And your training, I'm sure. So we'll make sure that we link all of those resources in our show notes. Is there anything else? I mean, gosh, I don't even want this interview to end, because this has been so thought-provoking and I've learned so much. But is there anything else that you would like to share, Karen, before we end our time?
I suppose the only thing I'd like to share is just to give people encouragement to know that there are ways of working with this. Learn about it. If they read the book on structural dissociation, it's by Van der Hart, Neuhaus and Kathy Steele. If they look into Janina Fisher's training, they can learn a bit more. She's also written a book just to start learning a bit more about this. Unfortunately, there isn't loads out there, but people are starting to look at this, and just learning more about it is incredibly empowering. And Neuhaus said that dissociation it's always going to be part of any kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, whatever it is. So it should be something that we're looking at. And I think that knowledge is growing. So it's just for people to go out there and learn more about it, because when you do know about it, it just enhances your therapy so much.
Absolutely. Embrace it, understand it, and work with it. I love it. And I loved our conversation today, Karen. Thank you so much for being with me. And I look forward to any ways I can continue to learn from you.
Well, thank you, Jenna. It was lovely chatting to you.
Take care.
You take care too.